Where's home for you?
You know what? Originally, I'm from Boston,
Okay.
moved to Tennessee, lived there for 20 years, and now I'm up in Kentucky.
Mm.
So, Kentucky, Cincinnati area, right over the river between Cincinnati and Kentucky. It's a really nice place to be.
Do you have a favorite?
Ooh, I have bits and pieces from each location. Like, I miss the food the most from Boston. I can't tell you how bad I
Mm.
miss the food. Tennessee was cool because you're right there in the heart of the music industry, and
Yeah.
Kentucky's cool because it's a little more sparse. It's not as congested. It's got beautiful scenery, nice parks and trails and hiking and all of that fun
Yeah.
stuff. And we're not far from Cincinnati, so if we miss the city, I could just cross the river.
As someone who grew up just outside New York City, Yonkers, New York, and actually lived in New York City proper, definitely considered myself a city guy for a while. Lived in LA after that, so I had stints in Georgia, but now I find myself in Minnesota of all places. So
Right. You just don't know how that stuff happens.
life takes some weird turns sometimes, and I just posted yesterday a picture of me letting the chickens out.
Right. I tell my wife that all the time. We bought this house 4 years ago, and I'm not used to. I've never lived in the country. It's a suburb, but we're in the country. And my house sits on a neighborhood lake. It's not like a big lake. It's just a neighborhood lake. But there's ducks and there's the deer that come through and there's turtles in our yard. And I find all that stuff fascinating. She's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm feeding the ducks." So
Yeah,
I've never had that opportunity to do things like this before.
yeah.
So,
What's your earliest memory of music?
ooh, earliest memory. I remember my dad. We drive around in his car, and he had, just a few cassettes. He wasn't a big music fan, but he had probably 3 or 4 cassettes in his car, or 8 tracks, or
Eight
we
tracks for
won't go
sure.
back to just how far that was. But I remember it was Barbara Streisand, Air Supply, and Kenny
Okay.
Rogers. So I would listen to those over and over and over again. So I think that's my first memory of music as a listener for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah. And, Kenny Rogers is just awesome, or was awesome.
Yeah, something about music of that era, because I was born in 1970, so I'm a child of the 80s for sure. And we had we called it the radiola, but it was basically the turntable and then the 8-track player in this piece of furniture that took up like a corner of the living room.
Half the room. Right. Yeah. No, that was great. And even in his car, the 8 track was a separate unit that was screwed onto the bottom of the glove compartment. I mean, it wasn't like cars today at all.
Yeah.
It was just stuck there. It was just so out of place. It was crazy. But hey, he came with the car like that.
I'm sure you've experienced this a lot, but there's something so powerful about certain songs, and you mentioned Kenny Rogers and Barbra Streisand. Like you'll hear it, and it'll almost be like a time machine. It'll immediately transport you back to that age, and then feeling like a kid
Right.
again.
Yeah, every time I hear Lady, Kenny Rogers' Lady, I can tell you, yeah, I can smell my dad's car when I hear it for sure.
That's great. When did you like grow that appreciation for music into something more like realizing you wanted to get more involved?
It was probably junior high school.
Okay.
And it was probably, I mean, I grew up in Boston. Boston's known for having a lot of rock bands. I
Yeah.
mean, Aerosmith was from there,
Yeah.
Extreme, the band Boston themselves. There's just so many rock bands that have come from Boston. And then Boston also has Berklee College of Music, which puts out a bunch of jazz
Yep.
students. So there's a lot of music in that area. And I just loved it. I would go watch them and I would just be mesmerized by the talent that was in that room. And I just wanted to be like that. And then, of course, too, you get all the girls who gave all the musicians attention, and I wanted that too.
Yeah.
So I would write songs and hope to get everybody's attention. It never worked, but I tried.
What was the big success you had with music?
Oh, a big
Or
success.
the biggest you could point
I've
to?
worked. I've had ones towards the latter side of the career that were part of Grammy Award-winning projects and things like
Yeah.
that. I've had a chance to work with probably. I lived in Nashville working on country records for 20 years of that 35-year career. And I've had a chance to work with anybody from as far back as Jerry Lee Lewis, Dolly Parton, and I've up to the more recent ones. Probably the more recent ones that I worked on was Keith Urban, Lee Brice, things like that. And now, granted, those were producers that I had the opportunity to work with. I met 3 producers during my time in Nashville, and each one of them were at a different type of music. So one of them was more demo style, the stuff where songwriters would go to them and they'd work out an idea for a song and then record it to try to sell that song to other
Yeah.
people. Then one of them was doing mid-level artists. They would do the artists that hadn't quite broken yet. And then one of them was doing the big artists that everybody would know.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a chance to work on all three levels. And I worked with those three people specifically my entire time there. So I had a chance to work on the biggest of the big to the smallest of the small. And I loved every one of them.
There's always those conversations you hear of these incredible recording sessions or late night recording sessions where there's just like some certain magic happening in the room, and probably stories that most people can't share publicly. But of your time,
You get a lot of things like that.
what happens in the recording studio stays in the recording studio, I'm sure. But are there any that come to mind that are like memorable stories that you can share?
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned late night sessions.
Yeah.
When I first started, like I said, I was living in Boston, and I did go to music school. Whole story behind all that, but I ended up coming back to Boston. And Boston had two recording studios in it. One, they were right across the street from each other, essentially. And one of them, I worked there during the day recording books on tape. And that was fun. I mean, I get to learn, but man, it's like sleepy listening to somebody read all day. And then the one across the street was more at night, and they were recording rock bands. And to me, that's where I wanted to be. And I laugh about it now because I didn't realize how much of an idiot I was at the time. But when I left school, I left with that diploma in my hand. And I thought, man, I'm hot shit. I just graduated. I've got this diploma in my hand. I'm the guy. And I got back to Boston. I said, look at this piece of paper. I want to work here. You know, you're lucky to have me. It wasn't quite that bad, but you get my point. Yeah. And they looked at me and they said, yeah, we'll take you. I said, great. They said, you can be a freelance engineer. And I had no idea what the word freelance meant at that time. And I learned real quick that it meant I had to go hustle my own work.
Yeah.
So as long as I went out and found the bands to bring in and record, then I get paid. But if I didn't, so be it. That's it.
Yeah.
They'll call me if they need me. But so I did that. I went out and hustled every band I could find. And it was about halfway through that experience where the owner of the studio came up to me and he goes, you know what? You're a pretty good producer. I said, I'm not a producer. I'm an engineer. He goes, no, you're a producer. I said, well, I better look up what producer means. So I look up producer, and essentially what he was referring to was the person who organizes the session and he brings in the musicians, brings in the band.
Yeah.
You know, knows what time to come in and record, knows what microphones to put out, you know, knows how to give advice to everybody in the room. So I realized that's what I was doing. So when I went to Nashville, I went to New York first, worked there for a while, opened up a studio, and I was producing rock bands, you know, massaging that craft of producing. So I thought I was hot shit, thought I was doing good, young and dumb. And so I said, okay, now I'm going to go to Nashville and I'm going to show them. And I get to Nashville, I'm like, I'm a producer, and here I am. And they said, yep, you're an intern. And I said, fantastic.
Oh, man.
So they put me in my place really quick, but it was the best thing for me because I get to work with the best people in the world.
Yeah.
And I get to see just how good they were. And I got to be with them every day and just absorb that talent. And it was fun. It really was fun.
What was that experience in music school like for you?
At that time, I've done it twice. And at that time, there was only this one small school. It's up here in Ohio. It was called a recording workshop. It still exists, but it's an intensive program. It was just a small 2-month program, 1 month for the core and 1 month for a specialty. But it was the only school teaching it at the time. So I convinced my parents, my father specifically, to let me drop out of architectural engineering college in the top 3 engineering schools in the world to go do, music in Ohio for a month. And at the time I thought, it's a college and it's this. And no, it was a music intensive program that I went through. But I went through it and I earned that piece of paper that made me an idiot. But nonetheless, the time there was awesome. I mean, it was a short period of time, but man, I remember it. When I first got there, because I drove my car, I had a new car and it wasn't anything great. It was just a small Nissan, but it was new to me. And I drove it out to Ohio. Actually, you know what? No, I flew to Ohio and my girlfriend drove it out to me when she came to visit. So that was cool. It was fun. But when I got there, there was the school sits at the valley of this hill, and on the hill there was maybe a handful of cabins where the students would live. So they're cabins that house I think it was 6 bunk beds. So you walk into the cabin, there's 6 bunk beds. It's really small. It's like the size of one bedroom, but it had 6 crammed bunk beds. But I was lucky because in my cabin there was only 3 people. So we each got to sleep on the bottom and store our stuff on the top. So that was really cool. And so I remember the cabins, and I remember it's kind of in the woods. And then the only thing, the school was down at the foot of the hill, and right next to the school was this little sub shop that every sub and everything they served was named after something at the school. Like this is the recording sub, or this is the 8-track, whatever. And I remember that, and it was cool. And they had just one game in there. It was some game where you try to get maneuver the ball around all the holes and try to get it to the top of the screen. So that was fun. But I explored one day, and I just went down to the end of the street, and I came across this laundromat. And I'll never forget it because the sign outside the laundromat said, "Laundry, milk, guns, and ammo." I was like, what kind of place is this? And then the last biggest piece, I don't even know how I forgot it till this point, was the area smelt so bad because there's a paper factory right down the road. And I don't know if you ever smelt a paper factory, but dear God, it's the worst smell ever. So, those are my memories of the school.
I'm sure if you ever came across that paper factory smell, immediately it'd be like, you'd be thinking of the school.
Right back to the school for sure.
So you had all these experiences with these bands. When you were looking at book bands to get them into the studio, were you looking for talented bands or anyone who just wanted to record a demo?
At that time, I was looking for anybody that would pay me to take them into the studio. And again, as a young kid right out of a program like that, I didn't have any idea how to sell it. And they had no idea what I was capable of doing, which is probably close to nothing at that point. So one way I found to get myself into the studio and get the experience was I would start writing songs. Okay. So I started writing lyrics primarily, and then I would partner up with somebody to do the music. Then I would hire the musicians to come in and perform the music, and then I'd find a singer of a band that I would want to work with, and then I'd hire that singer to come in and sing on my music. And then I would put it together. And at the time, people were doing 8-tracks. We did cassettes, when they first broke. And I put the full glossy artwork and everything. Then when CDs came out, I started putting CDs together with I was always trying to stay one step ahead of the technology piece. I didn't realize it at the time, but by doing that, people liked that because it was one of those things that they didn't know how to do it. So it's just like podcasting when it starts. If you haven't done it, you don't know how to do it. And you go to anybody and, wow, you know how to do that? So I was putting these CDs together. So people would come to me and ask me how to do that. So I would walk them through the process and, hey, why don't you let me take you in the studio? I can record you over here. We can do this. We can do that. And that worked. So when I went to New York, I took advantage of that. And I bought a building and built a recording studio in it. It wasn't glamorous once I saw Nashville, but it was mine, and it was capable of producing a product. So, but what I did was I built the control room in one live room where people would perform, and then behind it was a workshop, and next to that was a restroom, and then in front of that was an office, and then there was an empty room. So what I did with the empty room was I set up a photography backdrop and a desk with a computer with graphic design software. So anybody who walked in would have to walk through that room to get to the studio or to get to anywhere else. So when people would come in to record, they would see that. And then I could say, they'd ask me, oh, do you know anybody who could do album cover or photography? Yes, we can do it all right here. And I became a producer that could do all of the different pieces. And I think that's really what helped me make money, because people, when you're recording music, for whatever reason, nobody wants to pay the people who record the music, the most important piece of the puzzle. They don't want to pay it, or they try to get you to do it at a discounted rate. But when it comes to the photography or the graphic arts, they paid full price every time. Every time. They didn't even ask, how much does that cost? Well, that's, $12,000. Okay. So that's where I was making my money. And I took that money, and then it's funny again, me and being stupid and doing stupid things. I was sitting in the break room and I had a CD in my hand. I'm eating lunch with the couple other people that were working there. And I'm opening the CD and I noticed it was a Shania Twain CD. And I flipped it over and I'm looking at the credits, and one of the credits said Bob Bullock.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, huh. I said, I'm going to go to Nashville and work for Bob Bullock. And now the studio hadn't even been open a year yet. And it's my studio. It hasn't even been open a year. I'm saying, I'm going to go to Nashville and work for Bob Bullock. And everybody laughed at me, and rightfully so. They should have. And there was also a magazine on the table. It was called Mix Magazine. And I opened that magazine. I'm flipping through it. And there was an advertisement for SAE, which was originally the School of Audio Engineering, but it became SAE Institute of Technology. And I said, I'm going to go teach at SAE. And again, chuckles at the table, like, yeah, okay. Well, the next day I woke up, I locked the door at the studio, and I drove to Nashville. And I was determined I was going to do those two things. I mean, determined. Yeah. And no one was going to tell me no. So I get to Nashville. I mean, I don't even know if I parked the car somewhere. I mean, I literally got to Nashville, and I was in SAE's parking lot. And I walk in, and the young lady that was at the counter, I say to her, can you tell me who the director of the school is, or the director of education? And she goes, well, which one would you like? I said, the director of education. She points over at the elevator, says, go up one floor and take a right. So I go up that floor, I take a right. And I walk in, and just out of pure luck, I mean, I don't know how this would have ever happened, but it was my teacher from the recording workshop had gone on to become the director of education at this college. So I was like, this is it. And I walk in, and I'm like, he goes, oh, hey, Jay, what are you doing here? You came by to just visit? I said, no, sir, I came by because I'm going to work here. I'm going to be your new teacher. And he says, oh, that's fantastic. He goes, let's talk about your credits. I said, what do you mean my credits? He goes, well, who have you recorded?
Yeah.
So I tell him, he goes, who's that? I said, well, that's a band in Albany, New York. And I tell him another one. He goes, who's that? I'm like, well, that's a local singer in Boston. He goes, yeah, you can't teach her. And I said, what do you mean I can't teach her? He goes, you either have to have a college degree in this subject, which I took a certificate program. He said, or you have to have experience with major acts that would outweigh that, and we can get state approval for you to come in and teach. I'm like, oh, this is serious. This isn't just the little stuff I was doing back home. So I said to him, okay. And I said, what do you recommend? He goes, go get those two things. I said, I will. I'll be back. I said, I'll be back in a few months or whatever I said. He goes, yeah. He goes, I have no doubt. So I don't know if he was just joking, laughing, or what. But I left there, and that day I enrolled in a school. And I went to the school, and I got the degree. And then I made networks, and I was working for these producers, and I was recording records. So I went back to him. I said, he goes, oh, hey, how's it going? How far did you make it? You do anything yet? I said, yeah, I've got the degree, and I've got these credits. And he just looks at me and goes, huh? I said, yeah, here's the degree, here's the credits. He goes, you want to start tomorrow? I said, yes, sir.
Wow, what a story.
So I started, and I was working there maybe a year. And part of I worked there much longer, but about a year in, one of the things we would do is we would have these speakers come in, these people from the industry, all the famous producers, engineers would come in and talk to the students. And what we would do is have our students set up the studio for people, and that way when the guest comes in, the studio's there, they can go ahead and just start demonstrating something or doing something. Well, one day I see on the roster, Bob Bullock is coming into the studio. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. So I'm like, okay. And I tell the students, we got to do this, and it's got to be the best it's ever been. And they're like, well, we don't have the time. We can't do it. I'm sorry. We might have time between this or that. And I'm like, oh. So I went into the studio, and I set it all up myself. And, I mean, I spent hours because it was just me. And I got it all set up. And then Bob comes in, doesn't even say a word about it or anything. He just comes in, give him his instructions where to go, what to do. He goes in, he teaches the class, they love him. And as he's leaving, I'm walking him out. And he goes, "Who set up the studio today?" And I said, "Well, I did, sir." I said, "I hope I didn't mess something up for you." He goes, "No, it was really good." He goes, "Would you ever consider being my second?"
Whoa.
And right there in the lobby of the school, I said, "Yes, sir." "Yes, sir, I would." And I left there, and I think the first project we worked on from that point was Travis Tritt. And it was at one of the biggest studios in the world. And I was like, all right, it's not me doing the work. I'm assisting Bob,
Sure.
but I'm working on one of the biggest artists in one of the biggest studios, and it was just amazing.
What a story. What a collection of stories. So much to kind of unpack there. But it's, people say like luck is really when preparation meets opportunity, and I think you literally you had been preparing for that moment. And the vision you had, people talk about like Will Smith writing like a $1 million check to himself or something like that for, as an actor, something like that, and just framing it. Where did you get like this drive? Because throughout that story, there's this like inherent confidence or belief that you're destined for something bigger. And I'm wondering like where that came from.
Or it could have been stupidity. But no, I've always been a driven person. Even to this day, when I do something, I want to do it to the best I could possibly do it. I'm competitive.
Yeah.
I want to be the best out there. I mean, I have a show right now, the talk show that I do, and I want it to be the best.
Yeah.
There's not a week that goes by that I don't think to myself, what could I do this week that'll make it just a hair better or just a hair better? What can I get a better guest? Can I, record it differently? Can I balance the audio differently? Can I put in a new segment? I just want it to be as good as humanly possible. I never settle for, it's good enough.
Sure.
Because as soon as I do, I get bored, and then I'd want to leave and go do something else. I like to keep it exciting. My wife says I'm obsessive, and I have a phrase. I say obsession leads to expertise.
Yeah.
But the things that I care about, I'm obsessive over. But then I try to balance that with other things that I just like, it is what it is. I don't worry about those things.
How are you as a child? Was it clear if I asked your parents like back then, it's like, is this Jay? Has this always been Jay?
I think, that's a question nobody's asked me before. But that's a good point because I had two brothers, so I'm one of three.
Okay.
But there's a gap between me and my two brothers. They're 6 and 7 years younger than me, so they're really close. And I was more of a father figure because my father passed away before I even graduated college, so he never got to see any of it.
Okay.
My mother passed away early, but she was around for us all to be adults.
Yeah.
But I think the difference was being the first child and being alone, that I can remember my mother would buy me Play-Doh, and I would sit in the living room and watch the Flintstones. And the Flintstones would be on TV, and it would be Fred and Barney at a bowling alley. And I would take that Play-Doh, and I would turn it into a bowling alley.
Nice.
And I'd make the little balls rolling down the little ball return, and I'd set up little pins.
Love that.
And I just wanted to duplicate whatever I saw. So no matter what it was I saw, I thought, I want to do that.
Yeah.
And I can see that I got 3 girls. So I went from being one of 3 boys to having 3 girls.
Yeah.
And I can see that in my girls, they don't settle for us to go watch something. As soon as we see it, they're like, well, can we do it?
Yeah.
I take them somewhere to watch a game or to watch somebody sing, to watch somebody perform. And they're like, well, are we going to be up there too? It's like, no, we're going to go watch.
Yeah.
Well, what can we do to do it? So I just like I'm driven. I've got a lot of drive for, I don't know what reasons, but only for the things I care about. I can't stress that enough. When it's something I don't care about, I let my wife make whatever decision she wants, and it's fine. You want a different comforter on the bed? Sure, go for it. You want to paint the walls a different color? Okay.
Yeah. You pick your battles.
Right.
Can you teach that, or can you raise like kids to have that? Is it inherent? Is it nurture versus nature? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
That's good. I do not think drive is teachable. I think the technical parts, absolutely. I think anybody can learn what button to press. I'm sitting in front of a console now. It's not one of the giant ones we use in the recording studios, but in front of me is a console. There's a series of buttons. They're very repetitive.
Yeah.
You learn one strip of buttons, you know them all.
Sure.
So you can learn what the things do and when you press them. But what you can't learn is the amount of time it takes to sit there and practice on it to make it do something.
Yeah.
If you get bored easy and you're like, press it, move a few things around and go, oh, that's it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, the big thing, we had a speaker, a guy named Jeff Balding. He came into the college to do a seminar for the students, and it was in a classroom. He was just on a stage, and he was just talking. And he's one of the biggest engineers in the world. He works for a guy, like I worked for Bob Bullock. Jeff Balding works for Dan Huff. Dan Huff is one of the world's biggest producers. He's done countless, amazing country records.
Yeah.
So Jeff Balding is at one of the tops when it comes to audio engineers. He was in the school, and one of the students asked him, well, how did you become the guy? What makes you the guy? And he goes, I'm no better than the other people. And then why do you get all the work? Why do you get to work with Dan Huff? Why do you get to do this? He goes, the key is I stuck in longer than anybody else. He says, I'm not more talented than any of them. And I feel that way about myself, too. I don't think I'm more talented than anybody else when it comes to recording music. I think I just put in more hours, more reps, as people say. But Jeff Balding said, I graduated school, and I went into the studio, and I worked. And then I wasn't getting paid. I was an intern, and it took years before I wasn't an intern anymore. And then I started getting paid. So I was lucky that my friends would let me crash on their couch. And then, when I was getting paid, I didn't have a girlfriend. I didn't have a wife. I didn't have kids. So I was able to keep working. All of my peers went off and got married or had kids or wanted to go on vacations. And that pulled them away. They needed another job at that point to supplement what they wanted to do. He said, so they didn't put in the amount of hours that I put in. So when it came time for Dan Huff that says, hey, I need a guy, he goes, I was the last one in the room. It's not that he had a choice of who to choose. He goes, I was the last one standing.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, too, Dan Huff was his roommate in college, so.
That probably helped.
A little bit of that, too.
Again, preparation, opportunity. Like, I'm sure if he
go.
sucked, he would have hired him as well.
Right. Exactly.
So just to kind of wrap up on the music side, did you get to the point where you could tell if a band had or a singer had the it factor?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hands down. And what's funny is most of the celebrities really don't. Most of the celebrities, they're talented and they might have charisma, but it's usually one or the other. Very few have both. But there's some. And I interviewed a girl this week on my show. She's a 12-year-old girl, 12 years old, just hasn't even been singing a year. And she's on stage singing with Jelly Roll and all these other people.
Oh, wow.
And she sounds like a full-blown adult.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Those are those old souls. Yeah, reborn old souls for sure.
That's something that when you see it, you're like, you're good. Okay,
Yeah.
I get it. But then there's other people. I work with producers in the studio when Auto-Tune came out. I don't know if you're familiar with what Auto-Tune is, but for those who aren't, Auto-Tune is a device that you can use to manipulate somebody's vocal, that if it's not in tune, you can now make it in tune so it sounds like they hit every note perfectly.
Yeah.
Well, when that first came out, everybody wanted to use it, and they were misusing it. It sounded very robotic. The biggest example is Cher's Believe in Love. So,
which actually went on to be a big hit.
Right, because it sounded like
Cher.
an effect that you were using on somebody's voice versus a tool that went wrong.
Yeah.
So, but the country artists, they didn't want an effect that sounded like something. They wanted it to just make them sound good.
Yeah, yeah.
And so everybody started using it. And every project I worked on, Bob's projects with these big artists, when they would take their lunch break, I would hang back and I would tune the vocals. And I'd tune people that didn't need to be tuned. Some of the best in the world, that don't know their records were tuned.
Oh, wow.
Because their producer would say, tune it. And I'd be like, well, they hit all the notes.
Yeah.
Well, tune it anyway. It's like, well, you can see here on the graph, you can see they hit all the notes. Yeah, but that's not a straight line. That line goes up, touches it, and comes back down. Well, I want it to be straight. It's like, okay. So you tune all these vocals for these people who do not need to be tuned,
Yeah.
which kills me.
Yeah.
And, I did it. Sure, you're right. You're the one writing the check if that's what you want. But,
Yeah.
the ones that don't need it got it. And then
Yeah.
there's the ones that did need it and probably shouldn't have been there in the first place.
And those, even having the it factor doesn't necessarily mean success, right?
No. There's some people that are just absolutely amazing and never made it. There's some that are absolutely amazing and they become demo singers in Nashville. A very good example of that. Everybody knows Garth Brooks.
Yeah.
Garth Brooks was a demo singer in Nashville for years. All the charisma in the world, one of the best singers. He's just an amazing writer. I mean, everything. He can play the guitar.
Yeah.
He's amazing. Whether you like his music or not, that's up to you. That's personal preference. But as far as talent goes, you can't deny the talent and charisma the guy has. And nobody would sign him to a record deal. Nobody. It wasn't until he was about to give up and finally got signed to a record deal. And it was only, you got one chance, buddy. Let's prove yourself.
Yeah.
But he got it.
Yeah.
So that's an example of one that turned out good, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people like that. And then there's some people used to say that with Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift, when she first came to Nashville, made a record, most people did not like her. For whatever reason, they didn't like her. Her daddy paid her way into Nashville. It wasn't by talents. It was this or that. That girl, again, like her or not, that girl has more talent than probably all of the artists combined.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's just an extremely well-rounded, talented person, whether it comes from the writing that she does. And you can look at the actual craft of writing. The lyrics are very good. They're not just good, but they're not done in a traditional way. They're non-traditional lyrics. Their melodies fall into a non-traditional way. And she has a way of doing that non-traditional stuff and making it commercial and making people like it. And then she has a way of performing it and a way for marketing it. And she's involved in every piece along the way. So, I mean, the girl is talented. She deserves what she has. But she had a hard time, a very hard time making it.
Yeah. Sounds like she put in the work. So when did you decide you wanted to go from behind or operating the board to getting behind a mic?
That's when I got married. Well, there was a little stuff in between there, but I met my wife working in the industry. She was a photographer and a graphic artist. So when I would go into these studios to record these bands, she would be there taking photos, and then she would eventually go back and turn them into album covers.
Okay.
And we were told we weren't allowed to date because the company we were working for said you can't date a fellow employee, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Well, after about 6 months, they finally said, why don't you go ahead and date? So we did. I probably should have said no. I probably should have stayed far away. But she hates me. But no, or she puts up with me anyway. But yeah, so we got together, and the music industry was at a point where it was about to pivot and make a change. And a lot of people were starting to work at home. So there was less of a need for the big commercial studio. Matter of fact, in Nashville, Music Row, which it started as two streets. You go up one street and back down the other, and it was nothing but houses that people turned into recording studios, record companies. I mean, Sony, MCA, Warner Brothers.
Yeah.
Then all their studios and all their publishing companies and all the law offices were all up and down these two streets. Well, now if you go to Nashville, they're all high-rise apartment buildings and condos. I mean, they're just scaring all the big stuff out of Nashville.
Yeah.
So I saw that coming, and my work was starting to slow down. And, we'd only go in the studio to record the big stuff. Like, if you go in with Travis Tritt and you record all of the basic tracks, which is the drums and all the initial musical instruments. But then we would go to the producer's home studio and we would record the vocals, and we'd spend hours there. We'd spend so many more hours at their home studio than we ever did at the big studio.
Okay.
Now, I was lucky. I was getting paid the same on either one of those.
Okay.
But you could see the shift going towards the home. And I knew that if I stayed in the industry the way it was, I was probably going to be making less and less money each year. And I had to find a way to pivot with it, or I wouldn't have money. And at that time, I had just gotten married. My wife and I get married, and we wanted to have a family. And the hours that you put into recording records and working all night and setting things up and doing all this stuff didn't seem like it was the right path to be on anymore. So I was in the studio, and I made a very unconventional transition. Because I was in the studio, and I had earlier in life, when I was trying to make it in the music business, I had to find ways of making money. So I used to drive a limousine, and I would do that just because a friend of the family, he was a limo driver, and he had this big white limousine, and he needed somebody to pick people up at the airport one day. And he just said, "Can you drive a limo?" I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Yes, you can. You drive a car, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah." He goes, "It's just longer." He goes, "Come on, get in. We'll drive around the block." So I get in. He goes, "Just stop slower. Just realize there's a lot more weight. It's just going to take you a little longer to slow down. You got to make it nice and smooth." Then we get to a turn, and he's like, "Take it wider. Just longer. You just got to go a little wider." I said, "Okay." And we just literally went right around the block and right back. He goes, "Oh, That was perfect." I said, "Oh, great." He goes, "All right, take these keys and go down to the airport, pick these people up and take them over to this hotel." Man. I'm like, "What?" So me, again, being young and dumb, I did it. And those people tipped me $200 for a 10-minute drive.
Wow.
So I was like, yeah, I'm in. So I did that. During the first several years of my career in music, it takes a long time to break in.
Yeah.
But that was my steady source of income until I was able to break in. And by the time I got to Nashville and was teaching at the college and stuff, I didn't need to do that anymore. But when I was in the studio with these big artists, somebody was talking about how they needed transportation set up for their tour. And I was like, thinking to myself, I know how to do that. And they're like, who should we use? Who can we do? And I just chimed in and said, "You know what?" I said, "If you want," I said, "I can handle that for you." And at this point, they knew who I was because I've been working in the studio the whole time.
Sure.
And they trusted me. Probably shouldn't have, but they did. So they said, "Yeah, sure, great." So I just reached out to the local companies and just trying to find out who was handling it. And I arranged it. And just like producing a record, I handled the, administrative side of it. Got them a bus, got them hooked up with everything, and got a driver out there on the road. And they did it. And so they were like thrilled, "Thank you." And then the transportation company's like, "Wow, man, thanks for the referral. That was a really big deal."
Yeah.
And then the transportation company says, "Would you consider doing that for us?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." Yeah. So I transitioned to the transportation company. And now I'm working with all the same artists that I was recording, but now I'm setting up their tour buses and getting them on the road and transferring them back and forth to award shows.
Yeah.
And it was awesome. I mean, I had a blast doing it. All the people, I would pick up the same people, and they're like, "Didn't we just see you in the studio?" I'm like, "Yeah, guys got to eat."
That's funny.
I would drive them to the award shows, and that was a blast. And then one day out of the blue, when you're driving the celebrities in Nashville and stuff, you have to have a license, a livery license and all this stuff.
Yeah.
But then they will only allow certain drivers to drive the celebrities. And I got the credential I needed and the connections to do that. And I met a few, and I've got a really stupid story if you want to hear it later. But so I was doing all this stuff, and the band Iron Maiden came into Nashville, and they said, "Look, we need a driver." And I said, "Great, can do that." They said, "But we need one that's also certified to do security so we can do a transfer." So I was the only person that had both licenses because I had to get the licenses so I could train the drivers so they could go do the work.
Yeah.
Nobody else had the security credential. So I went out, it was one of those Mercedes Sprinters, I believe it was.
Oh, yeah. Sprinter van.
And I went to the hotel, and you should have seen, it wasn't like the Nashville artists. I mean, the Nashville artists, they could be walking down the street, people would just wave at them and say hello. But Iron Maiden had a crowd outside of the hotel.
I'm sure.
So, and I look like I'm a delivery truck. So I pull around back, and they sneak out the back door, and they get in the van, and they're like, "Oh, that was clever." So they get in the car, and they're happy. In Nashville, you see a bunch of people standing outside the arena waiting for autographs, waiting to catch a photo, a glimpse of somebody.
Sure.
But what they don't realize in Nashville, 2 blocks from the arena is a tunnel that you enter, and you drive underneath the ground into the underneath of the arena. So you're far. Nobody ever sees you pull in.
Of course.
So I drove them down there. I escorted them to the stage, and all I did is just part the crowd while they walk up to the stage and stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, I still have pictures on Instagram of that night showing me doing the stupid stuff. But it was fun, and I got to do all that stuff. But then I got to do others from there, which is where the stupid story comes in. I don't know if you want a stupid story.
Yeah, please do. We love stupid stories.
It was not my client.
Yeah.
It was the band Rascal Flatts, made up of 3 members, and I've had the opportunity to work with all 3 at one point in time. But one was my first time, and it was Joe Don Rooney, who's the guitar player for Rascal Flatts. And my first time working with him, he's married to a ex-Penthouse playmate, and I'm driving a Suburban, and they're both sitting behind me. And he's on the right side, so I can see him through the mirror. And we're driving through Nashville on the way to the award show. He's going to the awards. And he makes a phone call, and of all people he calls, he's calling his producer, which is Dan Huff.
Oh, yeah.
And he's saying, Dan, hey, we're winning this big award tonight. You're going to be there for us and all this stuff.
Sure.
And Dan must have said, no, I can't make it. So you could see his face just drop.
Mm.
And you could see he was physically bothered by this. And he goes, but man, you were there for Keith Urban last year, and I was really hoping you'd be there for me this year. And he said, sir, he goes, look, I'm sorry I can't make it. I'm not going to be able to make it there tonight. So Joe Don hangs up the phone, and he's, you could see he's physically just not happy.
Sure.
He's holding it in, but he's not happy.
Sure.
And at the company, we would put these iPads on the back of the headrests so they could, if somebody goes to dinner, they can pull up the menu or whatever they're doing.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's just frustrated, clicks on the iPad, and there's a picture of him on the iPad, just playing the guitar, and he looks at me and goes, Jay, this isn't your car, is it? I'm like, no, sir, it's not. He goes, it's Jason's car, isn't it? I said, yes, sir. I said, why is that? Was something wrong? He goes, no, he's just got my picture on the iPad. I said, you don't like that, do you? He goes, no. He goes, you wouldn't do that now, would you? I said, no, sir, if it was my car, it'd be Keith Urban. And I bit my tongue because I was like, right as the words came out of my mouth, I'm thinking to myself, you are a Yankee dumbass. Because I said that as a wise ass. And he lit up red like a Christmas tree. Mm. And you could see he was about to blow. Uh-oh. And his wife looked over at him and laughed. And finally, his wife laughing cracked him. And he goes, sure. You're right. Yeah. You're right. And then he just started talking to me, asking me about what my favorite band was and stuff. And we became friendly, and we had a lot of good interactions after that. I mean, a lot of good interactions. He's taken me to a lot of events and fun stuff. But that was my first night meeting him, and I came this close to blowing it.
Sometimes you have to just be yourself and let the cards fall where they may.
Yeah. Well.
So how did the podcasting start?
The podcasting, when I was a teacher, to me, I thought I was going to go in there and I was going to mold young minds. Again, the stupid things. You don't know what you don't know. So whenever you start a new venture, you think it's going to go one way, and you quickly realize it's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. So I was teaching, and I learned real quick, these students don't care about me. They don't care. All they want to do is work in big studios or talk to people who have got these major credentials.
Yeah.
So luckily at this point, I had a few credentials, but not what they were looking for. But one student really encouraged me because there's this software called Pro Tools, which is the industry standard software that everybody uses to record records. And it's just a digital audio workstation, which even podcasters use to edit their shows and stuff.
Yeah.
But I had a 3-ring binder that was huge, and it was just full of all my notes from out the years. And he kept asking me if he could borrow my notes. And he goes, man, this could be a book. And I was like, yeah, uh-huh. So I pitched it and turned it into a book. So nobody wanted to publish this book. Nobody. So I just published it myself. And I put it in the library at the school, but the school wouldn't use it as one of their textbooks or anything. They wouldn't even give it out for free to the students. So it just sat in the library. But another school in Canada, of all places, found the book and asked if they could use it as a textbook. So I said, absolutely. So they started using it. Then another college. And all of my students were buying it directly from me. And I was like, man, this is awesome. Now all of a sudden, I'm getting respect from the students just because I turned my notes into a book. So now it's in a book form. And then the publishing company comes to me and says, hey, let's go ahead and make a deal. And I said, no, not at this point. It's done. Yeah. It's already out. I'm already making money. Why?
You did the hard work already.
I just compared it to the artists who are putting records together. The record label is nothing but a bank. as an artist, I need you to pay for the product, and that's why you get a percentage of the money.
Sure.
The publishing companies, at this point, it's over. I've already done the hard work. So that's how I got the respect of the students. But the other stuff came after that, the things I did. I don't even remember where we're going. What was the question?
The
I'm sorry.
podcast.
I get carried away.
The podcast.
Oh, thank you. So as time went on, people would ask me, questions in the hallway in between classes. And I found out that they cared more about the stories and the questions in between the classes than they cared about the actual classwork. What was it like working with this person? What did you do?
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, they're going to ask me, how did you do this? How did you do that? No.
Mm-hmm.
What was this person like? What was this person like? Tell me the story about 50 Cent in the studio. What was he doing? Was he smoking dope? It's those type of questions. They didn't care about what processor you used or what gear you
want to feel like they're in the room.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, so they care more about that. Now, this is long before podcasting was podcasting. This was 2003.
Wow.
And so what I started to do is bring the people who worked on the projects. I brought them into the school, and I would sit on a stage, and I would interview them in front of the students.
Yeah.
And we would record that, and we were just putting them on a hard drive for students to take. So it was kind of a makeshift podcast. And then we just kept doing it. And then people started asking me to produce that for them. So they started wanting to produce podcasts rather than doing records. And then I just started saying, you know what? People seem to care more about the stories. So I started asking all my friends, hey, if I put a show together, would you come on and talk to me? And they're like, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Nobody thought I would do it. But I did it. So I put the show together, and I just started asking my friends to come on the show. And that's taken a evolution of its own.
Sure.
But I brought them on the show, and they're telling stories, and we had no idea what we were doing. And, it was just a way to start. And immediately, the director of the college, when I became the teacher, the director of education had moved on to a different school or something.
Yeah.
And they promoted me to be the director of education.
Okay.
And I became very friendly with the director of the school, who's still to this day one of my best friends.
Yeah.
And he had his own path he traveled, but he ended up in Las Vegas, and he was working for MGM Studios and doing some work there. And when I did my first interview, he listened to it, probably out of a courtesy or whatever. But he didn't tell me. He just listened to it. And he called me up and he said, look, I see what you're trying to do here. He said, but it's not good. I said, no, thanks. He goes, why don't you let me produce it for you? I'm like, well, tell me what you have in mind. He goes, at work, he goes, I have a TV studio. He goes, why don't you come here? We'll film it and put it out on the cable access channel.
Wow.
So I was like, okay. So at the time I was living in California, so it was a 7-hour drive to Vegas. So I said, I'll do that once a month. We'll film 4 shows and release them weekly.
Yeah.
Well, all that crashed and burned, but we still wanted to do it. So what he did is he says, there's this stuff where we can stream live on the internet.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what do you mean stream live on the internet? He goes, it'd be just like a cable access show, but it'll go to the internet instead of the TV.
Yeah.
So I'm like, all right, let's try it. And he used all his fancy gear and stuff and put this together. And then when he ended up leaving MGM, so he didn't have the fancy gear anymore, so we started using the software. I mean, we used anything from Microsoft Teams, Google Meets to Zoom.
Okay.
And then we started using things like, we use StreamYard now, but we
yeah.
used all the ones in between. But vMix was the professional one that he was using at his new company, so we were using that for a while. We were using that in conjunction with StreamYard, with Restream. We've done everything. But that's how the show started, and it was originally called Franze and Friends, which is just me talking with my friends. And then we were just talking to people in the music industry. It was just fun stories.
Yeah.
But then they wanted to learn stuff. So we're like, okay, so now there's an educational point to it.
Yeah.
And it grew and it grew and it grew, and people were liking it. And I'm like, this isn't what I signed up for. So I decided, I'm done. I've had enough. I want to just go back to what I was doing.
Yeah.
So I rebranded, went to the Jay Franze show, which is what it is now. And I'm back to just interviewing my friends and telling stories and
Nice.
having fun. So I think that's really how it turned out to get to where it is today.
How many episodes?
And we just did episode 100 with the rebrand, and it was
Okay.
probably 500 or something before that.
Oh, wow. How have you grown as a host since then?
Well, I like to think I've learned a few things because at the beginning it was horrible. At the beginning it was just me saying, "Oh, so tell me about yourself." Now there's so many different little nuances and things
Yeah.
I've done. Way I ask questions, way to sit back. Today's the most I've talked probably in the past 6 months. But no, I've learned little tweaks and specifically the type of questions I like to ask, and I take control of the way I want the interview to go now versus letting the interview just unfold.
Sure, sure.
I put something in my mind ahead of time. I do enough research that I know about the guests, but leave it enough that I'm still curious. And I try to start every show off with a question that they're not expecting. Especially when I get these people, these artists that come on that have been interviewed 500 times before.
Of course, yeah.
The music industry, they're interviewed all the time.
Sure.
A lot of times they're interviewed 20 times before my show, right? Same day.
Yeah.
So I want to ask something nobody else has asked.
Yeah.
So I do a little bit of research and I find something and then I go into it. And that's my first question. And usually they tilt their head like a dog, huh? And they're caught by surprise.
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden their guard is let down and they start telling me this intimate story. And
Sure.
then we just spend the time laughing and joking and getting them to tell stories. I don't know if you heard of a band called McBride and the Ride.
No.
They were a big country band now, but they were big in the 90s.
Yeah.
And they came on the show and they were answering the questions. They got on there. It was 3 of them. 3 different little windows popped up on the screen. And they're looking at me like, all right, let's get this over with.
Sure.
Yeah, they didn't say that, but that's how I felt. And they're looking at me like that. So I go down the rundown. I tell them who the audience is, what to expect, that type of stuff. And I ask an out-of-the-box question, which they're like, okay. He did some homework. And they're answering the questions. But then I had reached out to somebody. In my research, I found out who they were and who their connections were. So I reached out to the producer I used to work with. I said, you know anything about this band? And he's like, oh, yeah, because I'm good friends with them. I said, great. Tell me something that nobody knows. And he told me this. He goes, just ask about this mushroom. And I was like, I have no idea. I said, what's that going to be about? He goes, I'm not telling you.
That's funny.
And I'm like, all right. So I'm sitting there and I'm waiting for a moment. And it comes around to the guy that I'm supposed to address. It's McBride. I mean, it's the main guy. So I said, he looks at me. I said, oh, tell me, what's the deal with this mushroom? And he just freezes and looks at me. He goes, who do you know? And he goes, you've got to know something. And he just started cracking up. And he tells me this ridiculous story about how he got in a motorcycle wreck and ended up in the hospital. And when the nurse went to put in the catheter, his wee shrunk up like a little mushroom. And he was more concerned with the impression he was giving the nurse. And his wife's like, that nurse doesn't care 2 bits about your wee right now.
That's hilarious.
And so he's telling me all about this story. But then that opened up the floodgates. And then he's like, oh, you should have seen this prank we pulled on him. He was in the shower. We through a bucket of ice over him. He came running out of the shower after us and didn't even realize he ran out of the hotel room. And we're running down the hotel and there's families. And he's going past all these families butt naked. And they just start telling all these stories. But I don't think any of that would have happened in the early days.
Yeah.
In the early days, if I would have been like, so where did you record your record? It would have been horrible.
Is there anyone you follow or listen to that inspires you in terms of like how they handle interviews? Yes.
There's a handful of people I follow, different, as you're aware, being a podcaster talking about podcasting, that those shows that I listen to. And, I've talked to a few of those people. I know you had Dave Jackson recently on your show.
Yeah, I love Dave.
He was on my show once before, and great guy, came on.
He plays the guitar as well.
So I brought him on to talk about his book, and we talked about music a lot too. So it was a good episode.
That's great. Yeah.
But his co-host, Jim Cullison, I like talking to Jim. I like listening to Jim. Their advice together is funny when they do shows together.
Yeah.
But as far as people I look up to, you got the obvious, right? You got Tim Ferriss and Jordan Harbinger.
Yep.
Both amazing. But I treat it the same way I treat When I was trying to be a music producer and I was looking at other producers for inspiration and people, you want to be like.
Mm.
And I had a student ask me once, how do you know when you've made it, or how do you know when you're ready? Because you got to go from working for somebody to working for yourself at some point.
Sure, sure.
And I said, that moment comes when you can look at the person you're working for, see what they're doing, anticipate the next move, and think, I would have done it differently.
Mm. Mm.
So that's the approach I take to listening to other people like Tim Ferriss or Jordan
Sure.
Harbinger or any of the others. And I look at their shows and I think, man, I really like that. But, I would have rather have done it this way here. Or, man, the way they transitioned into this. Or like Tim Ferriss, I think is an amazing guy, very smart, very talented, and does a very good show. And I like to think that my show is like a format like that, but it refers to music industry instead of deconstructing the mind. And Jordan Harbinger, I think, takes a different approach, and he's got a few more verticals he does with his 3 different formats of a show.
Sure.
So I look at those things and I think to myself, well, I like that, but I don't know if I would have done it this way. And so I like to listen to things like that. I listen to your show. I listen to it every week.
I appreciate that.
So I like the story aspect. There's a lot of things, it's a much more relaxed format. So I like conversational shows that don't have a structured list of questions. I think you on your show, what makes you different is it's a very relaxed format. There is no clear path. It appears to me as if you're just trying to get the journey of the host that you're talking to. And you're trying to see if there's any gems within it. But you have a way of asking questions or navigating a conversation and then sitting back and listening. So you don't step on people, which is probably why I'm rambling right now. But you have a way of letting things go on, so you get that little extra bit out of somebody that they tell a story that they probably wouldn't have told if you asked another question.
For sure.
So I like that about your show. Jason Sircone, good friend of mine. I don't know if you're familiar with Jason, but he hosts a show called Let's Blow This Up, which is a podcast about podcasting, where it's more conversational.
I got to get him on.
He talks about podcasts and stuff, but his voice is just radio ready. And he's got a very, very good way of presenting material, and he does solo episodes and interviews, but the interviews are conversations. They're fun to listen to. I don't think anybody just wants to listen to somebody ask a series of questions.
No.
It's the conversation. It's like your show. I learned about your vertical farming. I never would have thought I would hear about vertical farming. It's like, what the hell are we talking about? I didn't even know what vertical farming was. But I listened to it. I'm like, I want to know more about that. It's like, how's that work? So it's things like that.
It's so interesting because I got into that because we own a production agency, so we knew how to produce the shows, and I just cut my teeth on long form interviews with this show. And so I didn't feel any trepidation because people are like, you're going to speak to CEOs about an industry that you don't know much about. And I'm like, because I'm just talking to them. And a lot of times they're more nervous than me because they hear we do pretty good production and we clean up the show. So they're just like, oh, everyone sounds so polished on your show. And I'm just like, that's part of the magic we do. But so I've really enjoyed this conversation, by the way, Jay.
Thank you.
One of my favorites in a long time. Thank you so much. You're a fantastic storyteller. A couple of questions we usually wrap up with. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
I would probably say I'll keep it related to the industry and the show. I think I've changed my way of thinking that other people are always right. When I started my show, I started it for a reason. I was having fun talking to my friends and telling stories, and it was just stories from backstage of shows. And people tried to convince me it should be done another way, and there should be an educational format or component to it. And it was fun, but it wasn't what I signed up for. And even now I do these interviews, and I always thought of, like, you grew up in New York. Everybody wanted to be Howard Stern. Everybody wanted, Bob and Tom in the morning or those type of shows. Those are more variety shows. And you had different segments that would break things up. It wasn't just a show. So I'd like talking about different things during the interview. It's like, don't just tell me. I don't want to just hear how you did something. I mean, I want to hear those things, but I want to hear the stories of what happened on the tour bus, or I want to hear,
For sure.
You guys didn't have a budget. How'd you market your album? tell me that part of it. You know, I'm interested in all of the pieces, not just the glamorous pieces. So now I try to incorporate those things into the show now. I don't want those to take over, but I do try to incorporate them.
It's just a function of being curious and being a good listener and just pulling threads. And that's kind of something that I've learned over the years, and just hopefully something that I continue to get better on. But it's just paying attention to what people are saying. And that's why I did video from day one. I was using like Skype with call recorder or something like that. And it wasn't recording the video, but I could see them. I said, I need that body language. And the inspiration for the show came from inside the actor studio.
Yeah.
And I was like, because I studied acting for a couple of years, and I was fascinated by that show because I was like, wait, we're getting to hear this actor speak for like an hour. I'm like, and it's not about, and it's, we're not seeing them act. We're seeing them actually talk like a human being. And I was like, okay, let's get behind the mic of these podcasters. And a lot of times the podcast is just the entryway into the conversation. And the other added bonus is that mostly they all have good gear too. So that helps a lot.
You mentioned that too. You ever listen to the Adam Carolla show?
Okay, every once in a while.
He had the girl on there that read the news. Her name was Gina Grad. And she's moved on to a different radio show now. But I had her on the show, and we talked one night. And you know, everybody asks her, what's it like working with Adam? What's it like doing this? And she gets the same questions all the time.
Sure.
And I asked her, you know, did she ever feel pressured into being the person who did the news? Because it seemed like when you have that group dynamic, it was always the girl who got stuck reading the news.
Sure.
And she just lit up like a Christmas tree and went off. And I mean, so I was like, okay, there you go. So it's little things like that make my night.
How long do your episodes run?
They're supposed to be an hour.
Okay.
Might go to an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I do edit them.
Yeah.
They stream live.
Okay.
We still to this day stream live. I don't know why I do that to myself. But I enjoy streaming live. I enjoy seeing the comments. I enjoy the fact that we can't retake something.
That's fun.
You know, and we do it that way. But then I do edit it for the audio release. I go through and I clean it up. I make sure everything's balanced. I make sure that the guest's vocal and my vocal are at the same level. I make sure that the intro's tight.
Sure.
I take out any glitches that may have happened from the internet. You know, I might take out a question that didn't go anywhere, you know, something like that.
When you're streaming live, are you watching the chat? Is that distracting?
I've gotten used to it.
Okay.
At first, it was massively distracting.
I can imagine.
But we had multiple people coming on the show. Somebody was always referencing the chat. I'm like, oh, dear God, where is it? But now I've gotten used to it, and so I can see the chat. And matter of fact, I have a stream deck over here to my right. I'm sitting there pointing like you can see it.
Yeah.
But I have a stream deck, and I've got it programmed to all the shortcuts for StreamYard, which includes not only switching screens and the different cameras and stuff, but it also includes the chat and stuff. So I can pull up the chat. I can see what's going on. I can respond to it. But that's taken a lot to be able to do that and still pay attention to the guest. The guest, like we're talking right now, we've got both of us on the screen. That's perfect. We can just talk. But think about it if you had to manually solo me when I'm talking, put yourself back, ask a question. Yeah. That stuff became a lot. So I only do it during special occasions now.
Any dream guest you're looking to get on the show?
Yeah, you know, I grew up listening to a lot of rock music, and I've worked in the country industry for years, so I'd like to get a few more rock guests on the show. Yeah. I've had a few good ones. I had the founder and lead singer of the band The Romantics came on, you know, What I Like About You.
Yeah.
That was a good night. He was a good guy. But I would like to get some of the ones I grew up with, you know, some of the older hair band type people, you know, Jeff Tate from Queensryche or, you know, Steve Perry from Journey or something like that.
Yeah.
Or even some of the more modern ones. I would love to have Lizzie Hale from Hailstorm.
Okay.
You know, that would be great. I've met her a couple times. She's super nice, took pictures with my family, but I've never had her on the show. I've had Five Finger Death Punch is one of my favorite bands. It's a hard rock band.
Yeah.
I had one of the members of their team on the show, but I've never had one of the singer or the band members on the show.
Well, definitely. Well, it's out in the ether now once this gets published. So
there you go.
So last question, what is the most misunderstood thing about you?
That one is easy, sir. I am not typically a speaker, so I don't typically talk. So you've done a very good job tonight by getting me to tell stories. I sit back and I listen. Even in my personal life, when I go places with my family, when we go out to parties, I have a fairly low voice compared to most, and it's hard to talk over music. Or so when there's any sort of crowd or music, I can't talk. So I just sit there and listen. At work, I really spend a lot of time listening to people to try to, like you said, read body language, try to get a feel for what's going on. And I don't smile. I don't know how to smile. You cannot just smile and show my teeth. So people think I'm mad all the time.
Yeah.
They think I'm mad or serious. Why are you so serious?
Why so serious, bro?
But I'm not. I've got a very dry sense of humor, and I'm constantly joking, but people think I'm serious. To the point where sometimes I have to say, "Do you really? That's a joke? Do you really think I would say that?"
Yeah,
So, I think that's probably the most misunderstood thing.
Well, I'm so glad we got this coordinated, and I really enjoyed. These are the types of conversations that really light me up. I tell people this all the time. It's so fun to look at the calendar and see something coming up that you're excited for.
Yeah.
And, I think hopefully I've gotten to the point where I'm just booking folks on the show that I want to speak with, that I want to have a conversation with, and this, keep me engaged and who are engaging as well. I do try to take a back seat when someone is such a good storyteller as you are. Yeah. And so I really appreciate you sharing some gems there, because there's some fun stuff. I don't know if it's stuff that you've shared in a while, but I really appreciate you.
You want exclusives? There's a couple exclusives in there. I've never told anybody the story about Rascal Flats or anything.
Well, we'll get people to jfranzeshow.com, Franze. Anywhere else you want to send folks to connect with you?
No, sir. If they want anything else, it's all right there.
All right, Jay. Thanks again so much. Really enjoyed this, and looking forward to future conversations at some point.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me.